No, that doesn't work either. Hmm. Oh well. Oh, hello.
You can't see me?
No, I can now.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it was just
Fantastic.
it's a slow machine, so it took a minute for the video to pop in when I, popped the window out of Discord.
Yeah, understandable. Okay, so, and you're gonna be grabbing a cup of coffee. I've got a cup of tea here, so I understand.
Right. Yeah. In just a few minutes, I'll run off and grab something.
Okay. So, it's been a while since we've had the opportunity to chat. um,
Yeah, that's nice.
so, do you want to just start off with a real brief introduction about yourself, and I guess specifically your history credentials, since that's going to be what I'm largely tapping into here.
Yeah, yeah. I guess sort of the most relevant thing. I'm Liam O'Mara. I'm a historian of ideas in Southern California. I uh, one of my well, gosh, I'm not even sure where to put it. I mean, as a historian of ideas, I always sort of like sit kind of in between like periods, looking at long-term changes and whatnot. So my research interests are pretty variable, but it's probably why I'm living in a house with 34 bookcases. and uh, the and I don't know, of the two main teaching fields in my PhD, one of them is Europe. I mean, I'm a European and Middle Eastern historian primarily,
Right.
although I do some thematic world history classes, and actually qualified to teach Russian history, which is somewhere back in this area here in the Europe section. So the issues like this are always kind of interesting to me. I
Right.
mean, I was a Cold War kid. I mean, I was a gosh, what would that be? Time wise, yeah, I guess I'm a Brezhnev baby. So, Brezhnev and Nixon baby, just barely.
There you
Um,
go. Yep.
so I kind of grew up in the shadow of all these weird ideological arguments,
Yeah,
and
and
was always sort of like confused by how people were suckered in by them,
yeah,
and that got
very
me
much in
started.
the thick of that. Yeah. Um,
Yep.
and I thought that would be the reason that I reached out to you is I thought that would be a very useful lens to look at, because what we're seeing is, out of like the posturing in Ukraine, doesn't look like anything new to me. And yet, of course, the media is all snapping at it because they have to ratchet up. We're gonna have to go into like World War III, and it's like, no, that's not what this looks
Yeah.
like. There
Yeah.
there are things that this looks like, but that's not really it. And
Yeah, for sure.
so yeah, the Cold War is very interesting. It's it seems distinguished from like a hot war because it's near peers at a very high like power level, who are actively working on not going to war but are jockeying for influence power. Is that a fair characterization?
So, thinking about the major players here, so what you're saying is that it doesn't look like anyone's actually truly trying to go to war, but is really just playing a bit of like brinksmanship to try
Right.
and score points.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
that's entirely possible, I think. Yeah, but there is an alternative scenario, so I can
okay.
hit that in a moment.
Okay. Well, so I just kind of to see if my read on the first Cold War it is correct. It largely
Mhm.
was like trying to establish who was the global hegemon, um, kind of, and
Yeah.
establish who has the main influence of ideas. Um, would that be a fair characterization,
Um, I think it's
or what
it's
would you
sort
say?
of a fair way of looking at it, especially from the American perspective.
Hmm.
I don't think it's actually at all what happened,
Okay.
especially since there was no realistic competition between the powers at any point. I mean,
Hmm.
at the height of their power, the Soviet economy was 1/10 the size of ours.
Hmm.
There was never any realistic competition between the two societies, except in a few like prestige competition areas like the space race, in science and technology, an area which the Soviets tended to excel.
Right.
And then in military kit, them spending quite a bit of money building up certain areas like their nuclear arsenal, whatever. But a lot of that was driven by a a need to maintain hegemony from the outside against a perceived threat. For me, looking at the origins of the Cold War in 1944,
Hmm.
in some ways missed the point that the Bolshevik Revolution itself was immediately met by foreign interventions and occupations. I mean, we intervened along on the side of
Yes.
the pro-Tsarist forces, and actually refused even to recognize the Soviet government until FDR, and that recognition is more a pragmatic acceptance of, well, it's fait accompli now. We can't fix it. In the same way that Nixon finally got around to recognizing China, um,
Right.
not an acceptance of the ideology, which was consistently pointed to as the greatest threat to global hegemony. Now, that hegemony before World War II was basically shared jointly between the U.S. and Western Europe.
Hmm.
The center of financial gravity shifted from London to New York at the beginning of the 20th century, but Europeans remained, dominant in terms of like global empire. So there was a lot of like overlap, and they shared that interest in suppressing any alternative economic models.
Right.
So it's sort of inevitable that there would have been that kind of ideological struggle, a kind of like complaint back and forth over it. But I mean, while it's common and fair in a sense, at least from our perspective, I don't think it's truly fair to say that it's a contest for hegemony, because the Soviets realistically never had a shot at it,
Okay.
never really tried for it, and most of their attempts at gaining influence in places like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, were largely attempts to counterbalance being pushed on the defensive and the need for some kind of allies, especially since they, under Stalin had changed directions and abandoned the idea of global revolution and instead kind of like focused on their own development. Well,
Right.
if you do that, you're always surrounded by enemies. You need to find somebody to kind of like, so the ideas did end up being in play, and there were argued extensively in the global south, and there's an extensive history of interactions there throughout the global south, but it's not really a contest as much as it is like, just playing out a fight between the ideas, not the countries.
Right. Right. Okay. So if in that like you had mentioned that it was largely over different like economic models.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm curious about, what I'm kind of seeing that I'm cautiously, slightly optimistic about, is the framing of this one so far seems different. Rather than economic model, it appears to be framed as democratic versus authoritarianism. And if I know that could shift, but if that becomes the framing, like actually whipping up support for democratic ideas, and making authoritarianism, the idea of it, societally toxic, could be a positive thing, maybe.
I suppose one thing I'll introduce there is that that's actually how the original Cold War was framed for the
Oh,
public,
okay.
was a fight over freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus authoritarianism. That was constantly how we were told to think of it, even though freedom was never really the point, since a great many of our allies during the Cold War were quite authoritarian states.
Okay.
What they wanted was freedom for international corporations,
Right.
freedom for Western corporations to continue that sort of like neo-imperialist, control over the local economies.
Okay.
But when you just talk about freedom versus tyranny, they're thinking economic freedom, but we're a democracy and they're not. And
Right.
that's the way it's always sort of been understood. I mean, Russia today still has elections, but it's about as democratic as the Soviet Union was, possibly even less so.
Right.
But the the fight there, really, when you're comparing there, I don't think a lot of people have a great deal of interest in that kind of ideological struggle anymore,
Hmm.
especially since in the US, hell, and this has honestly been terrifying me for a lot of years, actual support for representative democracy has been declining in the U.S.
Yeah,
Something
that's
like 30% of Americans are like, yeah, I don't care one way or the other.
yeah, that's the part that's been really terrifying to me as well. I admit that I've been trying to find like some silver lining amid like the what was the Summit for Democracy and stuff that they put together and
Hmm.
such. To because if some kind of faith in representative democracy could be restored, that's
I'd love to see it, honestly.
I know the system is not working well for a lot of people, for most people, but
Mhm.
the concept of representative democracy, I think, is generally a pretty solid one. uh,
Well, I mean, it's I don't know. It's as much as I can't stand him on so many other issues. That's one of the great Churchill quips was that democracy is the worst of all forms of government except for all the other ones. So, I mean,
yeah,
it's still not great. It has its problems, but yes, there's really nothing that we've run across so far in terms of large scale politics that does help as many people or give as
mm,
many people voices. I think there are better models, but no
yeah,
one's actually put one into practice yet.
right,
So I'm all for that. But as far as framing for the American public, I mean, when we are talking about that, and I mean, I understand the temptation to optimism there, but it's more, it'd be pretty cynical to do so, given
yeah,
that we have been steadily declining in freedom for decades now.
right.
I mean, we're no longer actually classed by Freedom House as a full democracy,
Yeah, we're a
and
flawed democracy in decline, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, flawed democracy and steadily slipping every year. And
yeah,
and people say, "Oh, that's all Trump." Like, no, 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 that
no,
started long before Trump.
yeah,
We're slipping away from it, and we pay very little attention to it. So it ends up being a kind of political theater if you
mm,
dress it up as a fight between, freedom and tyranny. The United States, realistically speaking, we do have a number of interesting rights, but we're also effectively a disguised police state,
right.
with the highest levels of incarceration in the world,
Yeah,
and the most heavily propagandized population in the rich world by far. But that's kind of the secret to being able to frame it that way is that people are so used to hearing America free. Okay, cool.
right.
Then obviously Russia not free. So it creates that interesting contrast in people's heads. But I don't think that really will sell
Okay.
the conflict. I see a lot of this in partly in terms of like the classic great power politics,
Yeah,
sort of like jockeying for position, because Russia always chafed at the fact that it was much poorer than the rest of Europe, because when all these other powers were sailing out overseas to establish their imperial possessions, the Russians headed overland eastward and conquered mostly snow. It turned out that they found a lot of natural resources in the long run there, but it didn't make them rich in the short run. They stayed a primarily agrarian state until the 20th century.
right.
So it has always left them a kind of like inferiority complex relative to the rest of the developed world. And there's a need to sort of like flex, especially when you're looking at the post-Soviet period. I mean, we've got a leader in Russia that says that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. That kind of longs for the influence the Soviets had, despite an economy 1/10 our size, despite an economy about the size of the UK's. They punched way above their weight for a lot of years
Right.
because they were the leading exponent of an alternative system and had managed to do a handful of things quite well. A lot of things very badly, but a handful of things like industrializing quickly,
Yeah.
very, very well.
Yeah.
And it impressed the hell out of a lot of former colonized peoples who wanted to ride those coattails. And I think that they genuinely miss that.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
a lot of like posturing.
They're from, I mean, even from just like 1918 through like 1950, Russia was largely transformed in that period.
Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, fundamentally. I mean, and I think it's
Yeah.
it's funny. I'm constantly watching like right libertarians and cap types are always like like they've accomplished nothing at all. Like show me one successful socialist example. Like, well, in economic terms, the Soviets clearly do it
Hmm.
because they industrialized more rapidly and brought more people out of poverty and out of
Yeah.
extreme poverty than we'd ever seen anywhere. It came at a tremendous cost in terms of personal freedoms, environmental devastation, all kinds of awful things. So it's not like you're defending the system by pointing to the things that they did do right. But the
Right.
reason that it was popular for a while, the reason that so many countries, in the former colonized world were embracing that statist model in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, was that example.
Yeah.
Was that in a few short decades they caught up to Western Europe.
Yeah. And I mean, so much so that they were considered in competition with the US, which
Yeah, which on paper is kind of absurd.
Yeah.
But it served everyone's ideological interests on both sides to sort of perpetuate that myth.
Right.
They had, again, that inferiority complex and need to sort of like flex on it.
Yeah.
And the Americans needed an enemy because we were determined to stay global hegemon after World War II, where we never had been before.
Right.
We established an unprecedented degree of control and influence in the World War II period.
Yep.
And with East Asia and Western Europe in absolute devastation, there was no competition for a long time for us.
Yeah.
So,
do you need to go get your drink, your coffee?
Sure. This is a good moment.
Yeah,
to do it.
Go for it.
I'll step out for just a second.
Yep. Don't want you to be without. All right, he's grabbing a coffee. I didn't want him to just let it go cold. He'd mentioned that it was brewing. I see you snuck in. Beautiful Skyrim. Don't have any thoughts on a centipede. That's off topic though. A puppy. It's a puppy.
All my four-legged children are harassing me. Yeah,
I
the
understand.
cats are demanding food. The dog wants to go play. Like, come on, give me some time, kids.
I understand. Yeah, our cats get pretty demanding here sometimes. Okay, so one of the questions that I wanted to ask you specifically was like, what to expect in the near term, and if this does actually go down the road of like a Cold War in the longer term, because that was a protracted event. That was like, what, 40 years? Something like that?
Let's see. It depends on where you cut it off, because a lot of people start to cut off the whole Cold War period really with Nixon's détente.
Okay.
Others take it into Reagan and Gorbachev in the 80s. So, yeah, 40 years if we count it up to Reagan.
Right.
But in many ways, it never really ended.
Well, yeah.
There was just like a short-term blip in the early 90s where both powers reduced some of their arsenals.
Yeah, and stopped.
Have been steadily building up ever since.
Right. I think the main reason that kind of left kind of public thought is there wasn't as obvious of conflict is the wrong word. What would the term be for regional tensions, I guess, where they're kind of.
I'd say the issue there in terms of dropping off from our consciousness has much more to do with how limited our sources of information are about the world.
Okay.
Just how like the kind of tunnel vision that we have, because the tensions never really declined anywhere in Europe or in Central or East Asia.
Okay.
The competition there and the constant flexing was always there. And with the shift, I mean, you have the short-lived alcoholic presidency of Yeltsin, but when Putin is moving into power in 99, there's a great deal of flexing that happens from that point on and rearming. So
Right.
This has been going on really for the last 23 years. This isn't new.
Right.
And they've been involved in a number of disastrous conflicts since then. Everything from the Chechen conflict, the Georgian War, the annexation of Crimea,
Hmm.
and then you've got the whole Shanghai military security zone that they built up there, and as well as the economic cooperation stuff with a lot of the Central Asian powers, trying to like recover some of the prestige. And they started like flights again with nuclear armed bombers. There's no reason to, but they're doing it just to kind of like beat the drums.
Right.
And we didn't pay attention. Realistically, over the last 20 years, the danger of actual nuclear conflict went up, not down. And you see this when people like the Union of Concerned Scientists have that doomsday clock, and
Yeah.
people paying attention to it. A lot of it has to do with the decline in the infrastructure in Russia. A lot of the outdated computer systems or whatever that could cause an accidental launching, and
Okay.
an accident could kill us all, because as soon as the missile's in the air, you got to commit or we all die or something. I mean,
Right.
the US is going to like roll over and say, oh sure, you can totally nuke Ohio by accident and we're not going to do anything at all. I mean, it doesn't really work that way.
Right.
So it's, I think, largely a creature of our media spaces and short attention span. And then there's all the paranoia over rising power in China as the Chinese economy grows and they recover their great power status. That terrified a lot of Americans. Realistically, that was always inevitable, regardless of the economy,
Well, yeah.
because they were one of
They
the
have huge
two
resources
global
and
superpowers
manpower.
for ages.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the 16th, 17th century, there were only two powers in the world that were remotely, global in strength. I mean, and one of them was China.
Yeah.
So it's inevitable that they were always going to recover some of that, but it freaked a lot of people out. And then we got concerned with the Middle East and oil and the war on terror and all that business, and just what ends up happening, because what drives a lot of the entire Cold War period and what got people so worked up, I mean, not talking about like behind the scenes with like bankers or everybody else is sort of like terrified of the economic changes, but the need to make some money off of it. I mean, when
Hmm.
we started arming for World War II, vast profits poured into a private defense industry, and we chose not to roll that back. We chose to massively expand it. World
Mm.
War II is the first time in world history that a power won a war and then didn't disarm. They started spending more money, and we spent more money year on year, not less.
Right.
And that's saw tremendous profits pouring in, and you need an enemy for that. So when the Soviets started saying, you know what, we don't want this competition anymore. We don't want to like be pushing around, and you started that process in the 70s and then into the 80s. They started like easing tensions, releasing Eastern Europe, everything else. Then we needed to manufacture a new enemy to justify continued spending, and that ends up being international terror.
Right.
So because of that, because of the corporate interest in spending the money there and keeping the defense spending going up year on year, that massive corporate welfare that it adds up to, then the media follows suit, especially given, I mean, I'm sure you know this, but like five corporations control 85% of what we run into.
Yeah.
And they all have interest in tons of other areas, including defense sectors.
Right.
So there's a good reason to talk about threats in the world and to keep us a little bit scared. I mean, we know that politicians on the right play with fear a lot more aggressively,
Yeah.
but it's true across the political spectrum in the US.
Yeah.
That fear is a major motivator, and it drives a lot of our media space. And if the Soviets weren't playing along anymore and they weren't willing to play the part of the big scary Russian bear, then we needed to manufacture a different one. And in the process of that, we stopped paying attention to all the tensions in Europe. I mean, how many Americans know anything about the conflict in Transnistria, for example? I mean, there's been a breakaway portion of Moldova, since the 1990s,
Mhm.
right? Or like the fights in the Caucasus, between like Armenia and Azerbaijan, which effectively is a proxy war. Because
Right.
Armenia has among the closest relations to the Russian state of any former Soviet republic, and Russian troops never left the territory. I mean, there's a lot of these weird little conflicts, or like the tensions over NATO expansion to the Balkans.
Yeah.
That almost turned into a big problem here.
Yes, it did.
We just stopped paying attention in terms of the American media.
Okay. I also wonder how much of that is. I know after Vietnam, media coverage of conflicts was scaled back drastically. and far insofar as actual real on the ground journalism, um, because we didn't want to sour people on the idea of war.
Right. Hard to, get people like, beating the drums if, you're constantly seeing bodies being loaded onto planes and
Yeah.
yeah. But we weren't directly involved in a lot of these the later
Yeah.
conflicts there, so it was pretty easy to tune them out.
Sure.
And that's a lot of like, I mean, we're almost unique in the world in the proportion of monolingual speakers. We have two giant oceans, only two friendly neighbors, one of which speaks the same language, more or less.
Yeah.
And we don't pay a great deal of attention to fights everywhere else. So the all these different tensions, the different, I don't know, the whole like Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the Transnistria thing, the constant problems and protests in Belarus and Ukraine. I mean, they're not news because no one really knows what's going on or cares. We don't have a basis really to make sense of it. So if the news did talk about it, it would come across to most people like out of touch gibberish. Now, we did have an opportunity for a little while in the U.S., especially at the very early days of television journalism when it was intentionally a loss leader, and they really tried to, I guess, raise consciousness about issues and be fair about things. But even that, relatively short-lived, and it's easily overstated because it's still heavily corporate in its structure. And the newspapers were always heavily partisan and corporate in their interests. It used to be much worse than it is now, not better. So we never really we focus much more on our internal conflicts, on
Right.
our issues, and we just don't pay much attention. And we've never had the kind of media that consciously tries to expose us to things.
Right.
Where a lot of media around the world talks constantly about global affairs.
Right.
I mean, if you want to see a lot of good reporting on sub-Saharan Africa, tune into like Al Jazeera.
Yeah, Al Jazeera is
or
excellent.
even like some of the Indian newspapers do a great job there. Tons of European papers are published in tons of languages. They have reporters all over the world and actively engaged there. We don't.
Yeah.
We have like kitten and tree stories.
That's a fine cat.
yeah. She's Minerva was great. She's my little Roman war goddess.
So, while the media coverage is abysmally low, and the understanding of these tensions is very low, what do you suspect that would look like if, as it appears, kind of some of the political rhetoric and the powers that be decide that this is a thing they want to invest in attention in, and like political capital in, that is to say, like, whether it be to continue to justify military budgets because we just pulled out of Afghanistan and don't have any conflicts that we're involved in that people are aware of, even though we do have like 100 deployments going on.
Mm-hmm.
But
not to mention that we haven't truly left any of these places.
I know, yeah, we have
but whatever.
Yeah, we have thousands of troops all over the place out there. But but as far as people are thinking, like, we're out of the 20 years that we were there, and we scale back military, and now this comes along, and if that were something that they decided they wanted to capitalize on or what have you, what might that look like from a messaging perspective, and what might that look like from a actual positioning sort of thing? Because they're not gonna, in my understanding, typically, like, we're not gonna throw a bunch of troops and start shooting, but we will put them into positions and do like firing tests and things, drills, and there was kind of a lot of that, it seemed like, through some of the
they're two very distinct areas there.
Okay.
In terms of how you sell a conflict like this, how you talk about it, the way it's framed and messaged
Hmm.
is one thing, but there is so we mentioned at the beginning that there's a sense of like saber rattling brinksmanship going on here, but no real interest in conflict,
Hmm.
and especially from the Russian side, they know they can't actually handle a real conflict.
Right. I
I
don't
mean,
think they
hell, their
even,
their soldiers were dead drunk during the Georgian War.
even if the U.S. weren't involved, I don't think they would want to slug it out with NATO. Um, you know.
No, no, they realistically couldn't.
Right.
I mean, the only thing they could really compete in is still like a strategic exchange, but not an actual, conventional conflict.
Hmm.
So they're not really interested. That's true, but there is a military dimension to this, and there is a way in which, I mean, I think that we will see an increase in actual combat. And one of the things that we've simply not been paying enough attention to, the fighting in Ukraine has been quite intense for some time.
Yeah.
I mean, the fighting all across the Donbass, and it's honestly, gosh, thinking of the messaging from it, it's honestly like disturbing the degree to which we keep talking about freedom in Ukraine and ignoring the fact that there's some significant neo-fascist politics, playing out there. I
Yes.
mean, this is not, a really friendly liberal democracy that we should be totally embracing right away. But the idea of NATO expansion is profoundly appealing to a lot of people who want to maintain its relevance, and especially who want to maintain the defensive postures and the defense spending. Because having major threats in the world, having big alliances like NATO helps to again justify funneling more and more cash into that, so you need to keep that up. There was no reason to expand NATO the way it was. We didn't need to bring in as many Central and Eastern European countries as we did, much less three former Soviet republics.
Mm.
But we did it anyway,
Hmm.
right? I mean, because the whole point, theoretically, of NATO was to provide a defensive screen to make sure that the Russians didn't expand further in Europe, right? Never mind the fact that NATO was created before the Warsaw Pact or any credible threat, and the fact that the Russians had no realistic possibility of attacking or taking Western Europe. But
Yeah. I mean,
that's
it prompted
it's
the
like,
Warsaw Pact.
yeah, I mean, but that's its raison d'etre was, supposedly a defensive pact to protect against the Russians, right?
Hmm.
Well, if the Soviets are like Cold War's over, and then they collapse completely, and then there's dirt poor Russia left
Right.
over in profound crisis, why was NATO expanded at all? And it was expanded because it continues to spread, global hegemony for us. And, putting more bases in different places means more spending and replacing equipment, being able to sell equipment to all these new allies because, hey, if Estonia wants to start buying stuff, they're going to buy it from us now, not the Russians. And hey, there's more profits for Raytheon to be had there.
Right.
There's the governments in both Georgia and Ukraine were, not even remote. They shouldn't even remotely have been like good candidates for NATO. They certainly couldn't for the EU because they don't have anything like the human rights records that they would need. But we did talk seriously about trying to expand it into both of them. Our talk about trying to bring Georgia in is what prompted the Georgian War back in what, '08?
Yeah.
And the
Thereabouts.
Russian support for Abkhazia and South Ossetia breaking away from it, and the conflict there, was to try and flex and make sure, no, you can't move any further into our sphere of influence, and they actually succeeded in that,
Hmm.
and that's why this situation in Ukraine is actually more dangerous than people tend to think,
Okay.
because they have shown a willingness to use force in their what they perceive as their sphere of influence, and they've gotten away with it, in two major ways so far: in the Georgian War, and then in the annexation of Crimea in 14.
Right.
And we forget that was quite a while ago. We were, what, 8 years now, and like, okay, right, okay, what happened?
Yeah.
They got away with it. They simply seized a large chunk of territory
Well,
from a
they
sovereign
and if they
state.
spread it out across several years, and let things cool down, take
Yeah,
another bite.
exactly. And
Yeah.
then ratchet tensions up again, and you're still flexing, you're still maintaining your supremacy in the region, and you're reminding people in Belarus and Ukraine that they have no realistic prospect of joining the Western Europeans anytime soon, that they're sort of stuck in the shadow of Moscow.
Hmm.
And I think that they can get away with that. And Putin has actually shown himself to be quite adept at both the brinksmanship aspect of it, as well as getting away with, actually brutal conflicts. I mean, that starts at the very beginning. He got his position because, you know, of the whole Chechnya conflict. And he destroyed Grozny. like just bombed it into the Stone Age and then put a vicious dictator in charge of the area.
Hmm.
And what's happened since then? We don't notice at all. And now today, you have effectively like, LGBT concentration camps in Chechnya. It's a
Yeah,
pretty brutal regime,
it's
but
awful.
yeah, but they got away with it. And he has, a pro-Moscow player there and, no realistic prospect of another conflict. So yeah, as long as they're spaced out and as long as he manages to outmaneuver things, I think he can get away still with rather a lot in the area.
Hmm.
And I do think that there is a realistic prospect of, further conflict and splintering inside Ukraine. But that's sort of a bigger question. The framing one is the one you want to start with, I
Yeah,
think. So
mostly because I'm kind of curious to get people to think about what they're going to be seeing, what they might expect, and kind of how to read between the lines on what rhetoric and stories may be coming out.
yeah, and there's a lot of
It's,
history to draw on there
the Cold
too.
War itself was propaganda 101. Like, it was.
Absolutely. And you had to focus on the worst possible stories about everybody that you wanted to put on the other side, regardless of how friendly you were to them beforehand.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. Noriega was our buddy until he wasn't. Saddam Hussein was our buddy until he wasn't. There's always this shift.
Right.
But the messaging, can turn pretty fast. And this is one of the reasons that, despite in legal terms, the U.S. having one of the freest media spaces in the world because of the First Amendment, we actually have one of the most restricted and propagandistic media models anywhere in the developed world, because we're so heavily consolidated, and there's so many shared interests there that they fall in line behind the messaging over and over and over again.
Because there's
So
money behind it. Yeah.
right. So framing this as, a struggle for freedom and, like liberty in Ukraine, and we should all want to back the Ukrainians, that will show up here. And, obviously playing off Putin, who is a literal neo-fascist, and then the white supremacists that are fighting in the Donbass. I mean, there's a pretty obvious good enemy. We can point to them and say, hey, look, these are bad guys. There's like literal neo-Nazis fighting here. So we should want to be on the other side of that. And then, of course, we'll ignore how corrupt, and authoritarian the other side is, because at least it's not that one. You kind of choose the enemy you want. The fact that
Right.
there's really no good guys here doesn't matter, as long as you can paint one side the way you want in order to justify it. And I think it's remarkable the degree to which Americans are kind of primed to see Russia as a very aggressive imperialistic power.
Well,
When
there was several generations that grew up under that drumbeat. So
absolutely,
yeah.
yeah, and they're still around, and it's never truly disappeared. And,
Right.
and it's amazing to me. I constantly running into people in their 20s that appear to have imbibed all of the same Cold War propaganda that was around in the 60s. Like, where are you getting this from? It's apparently still there. I mean, hell, the invasion of Afghanistan in '79 was the first time that Soviet troops had really deployed in a formal combat since World War II.
Hmm.
They had, participated in several proxy conflicts. I mean, some like, North Korean planes were actually Russian pilots or whatever. I mean, there were some places where they slipped in, but it was the first actual war,
Right.
since then. Meanwhile, we had invaded dozens of countries by that point, in the few decades after World War II. But we are conditioned to think that they are an aggressor and we are not. We defend freedom and they do not.
Right.
So you don't really need to do much. There's really not a whole lot they have to say in order for a large chunk of the population to come on board. The only thing that's truly tricky for this is that a Democrat is in the White House. Now, Democrats, again, especially like the neoliberal types, like your Bidens out there, who are massive, massive war hawks, and like more money for the industry, all the time. I mean, that's there for them, but a lot of their base doesn't share the same kind of knee-jerk belligerence
Right.
that you'll see among the Republican base. And the Republican base, because they're so hyper-partisan, are going to talk down the possibility of conflict just because Biden is there. If it were somebody else, if it was a McCain type figure, then they would be the ones beating the drum and saying, we must take down Putin. But they won't.
Right.
So there is a serious break on their ability to push things very far or to get very involved because they realistically have no constituents. It would be a massive, massive political problem for him to sell that and to maintain it, just because portions of his own caucus in government don't want it, and the base overwhelmingly won't want it.
Right.
So they're going to be able to sell this largely by pointing to Putin bad, expanding democracy good, but we're not going to really go too far.
Right.
Like maybe we'll lay sanctions on them or something. And there'll be a lot of talk about sanctions. And realistically, there's a lot of damage that could be done there because Russia is a petrochemical state. They are completely dependent upon the oil and gas industry. If they were not able to export oil and gas, the economy would have completely collapsed already because they let so much deteriorate after the Soviets and so much of the diversification of the economy because the ruble collapsed. There was no real investment. There was tons of cronyist, selling off all the stuff here and tons of corruption and gangsterism. So the actual foundations of the real economy are gone. So without pumping that stuff out and having a market for it, they're in real trouble. It's funding not only all of his defense spending, but most of the social spending as well. It's basically paying for the entire government.
Right.
The problem there, and this is one of the things that terrifies me about how close this could get, is if they do serious sanctions, what it would do is it could push them over the edge because it is such a potent threat to the real economy. Which means that I think that we'll talk a lot about sanctions, but we'll end up doing very targeted ones, pointing at specific, people connected to different companies or the military or something, or the assets of a particular Russian company. We're not going to just shut off Russian oil. We can't. I mean, the Germans are dependent upon Russian gas.
Right.
It would have a ton of it could crush the Russian economy, but it would also take down a large share of the global economy. So we can't actually do it, and Putin knows that. He's absolutely aware that sanctions are a paper tiger. If they were strong enough to really bite, it would push him into an actual war because he'd have no other option.
Yeah.
But if they're mild, then it's going to be just a one of those dog and pony shows. It's going to be nothing. We'll act like we did something really cool and strong. We applied sanctions to the bad guy, and meanwhile he seized the Donbass or something, and nothing really will happen, and we'll end up repeating the Georgian conflict, the Crimea annexation. He'll win again.
Not to mention that a lot of times when we lay down symbolic sanctions like that, we often will do intermediary trading anyway.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, the sanctions did a tremendous amount of damage to ordinary people in Iraq. But they actually strengthened Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
And we ended up allowing him to sell tons of oil anyway, which then helped prop up the government and then made people more dependent upon him to distribute food and medicine. So that was a massive scam too. But think about the way that was sold to the American people. I mean, they were so committed to them, and willing to say, yeah, sure. I mean, 500,000 people can die, and that's totally okay with us because we got to stop the bad guy. And Americans just rolled over for that. So I'm planting sanctions, I think we'll very easily swallow, and then we'll just turn away and not pay attention to the results.
Yeah, I've been increasingly critical of sanctions, but I do have to ask because I think you would be the person to know this. Has there ever been a case where sanctions were actually a net good? Because it seems like they just always make things terrible for everyone living in an area and don't effectively achieve whatever the aim is.
It's hard. There's a few places where it's kind of a mixed bag, and there is some possible benefit to it, but also a handful of weird downsides. I think a really good, a kind of an archetypal example you could use there is South Africa. When the Europeans started cutting off the apartheid regime, it started really pinching the economy. And Reagan tried for a long time to hold out and keep us trading with them, and allowed them to sell all kind, selling Krugerrands or whatever to Americans, and trying to keep that whole boom rolling. But eventually, Congress overturned his veto, and we applied the sanctions. And lo and behold, Mandela is released, and they start the process of democratization in the country.
Okay.
The downside is that the years of sanctions with the Europeans and whatnot, the increasing isolation in the last years of the apartheid regime, actually caused a further consolidation of power within the South African economy. Some consolidation there that has made it harder to raise people out of poverty. You've got like an official 40% unemployment rate. It's horrifying,
Mm,
and there was actually some real economic damage
right.
that's made it hard for them to, as they're expanding rights, they need to bring more people out of poverty, and they have less of an ability to do so. So if there had been a better way to convince them to give up the whole white supremacy bullshit, that would have been good. As it happened, there wasn't, and they were absolutely committed. So the sanctions, I think, did do the job.
Okay.
It's so there is actually an argument to be made for them in some contexts, and when you know that you do have leverage. The
Okay.
South African economy was fragile. It could be pushed over the edge by being cut off from a few major trading partners, and as it turned out, that was all it took to cause a major change.
Okay. I'll have to look into that one more. Yeah, because every time that I look at them, it seems to just devastate whatever country it was, and usually doesn't actually achieve the political goal in mind.
Right, and this is a case where it did
It
actually do a tremendous
did.
amount of economic damage, which has made it harder for
Yeah.
the ANC to make real progress there. But it did get rid of a white supremacist government, so there is a good there, but
Yeah.
it's still the
It comes
damage
at a
that you
cost.
see
Yeah.
absolutely still there.
Yeah. All right. Um. So. Okay. So yeah. Short term, that kind of nationalist, jingoist rhetoric. Long term might see waves of kind of token sanctions. Meanwhile, Putin continuing to take a bite here and there when he thinks that things have cooled
Mhm.
off enough.
And because there's money in it, increasing deployments into the area. So we'll have other powers in the region that will continue to clamor. There's a lot of, I mean, the Baltic states, the Poles have frequently been like, "Hey, we're scared of the Russians. Can you please put more stuff here?" I mean, the Poles were like begging us, "Please put your missile defense system in our country, not somewhere else."
Yeah.
Um, so there will be increasing cooperation there, and ultimately that is, and this is honestly sad that this is the case, but that's one of the reasons for pushing tensions like this. From the perspective of, say, like the Biden administration, it's less to get us closer to any kind of actual conflict and more to sell more weapons and influence in the region. Because every time it looks like we are willing to stand up for one of these Eastern European powers, they grow more and more dependent and closer to. And one of the major differences between NATO and the EU, or NATO and Western European powers just individually, is that NATO has always been willing to deal with authoritarianism. We don't care much about how corrupt the government is. So, Poles are losing rights, Hungarians are losing rights. Who cares? Whatever. We're still just as chummy
Mm,
because NATO is about selling American hegemony and influence and selling weapons.
right.
It's not really about you know freedom or human rights or anything like that.
Right.
So I think that that's the long term here is going to be kind of off the stage for most Americans. We'll see a little chest thumping, we'll see some token sanctions, we'll see some deployments there, and then mysteriously it will drop out of media discussions just like the Georgian War did, just like the Crimean conflict did. We'll slowly forget about it. Meanwhile, again, if you're following the European press, you'll see a tremendous amount of increased cooperation. You'll see more advisors on the ground, more troops on the ground, more weapons being sold. Hell, the Ukrainians have been unloading a ton of American equipment.
Mm.
They're not a NATO member, and they've got, oh yeah, cool, missiles for us, right on,
Mm-hmm.
and happily deploying that stuff. And we love it because even if they can't afford to buy it, if the U.S. government gives it away, the corporations that made it still made their money.
Right.
We paid for it.
Yeah.
So it's still that great like cash sucking phenomenon, like the money hoovering of our defense contractors, all that will continue. And I think that's ultimately the real objective of the saber rattling here from our perspective.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I have a question from a chatter, and it's one that I wanted to ask too. So sanctions largely going to be ineffective, and if you ratchet them up too much, you're going to push things into volatile territory. So, many in chat asks, you can wave your hand and implement something. What specific sort of trade policies would you push for with both Russia and Ukraine in the midst of this? Or more broadly too, what policy would, or what kind of path would you take in even addressing this in general, not just trade?
Yeah, if I could combine those.
Yeah.
I'd say that what we really ought to have been doing was investing in human development in a lot of these former Soviet territories, not in weapons, not in putting more tanks on the ground, but hell, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had the largest per capita number of computer programmers and mathematicians in the world. I mean, they could have been a major site of like global technical innovation. We could have had like a Silicon Valley on the Black Sea or something, but it didn't happen. So, I mean, of course, there's tons of them on the dark web now,
Right.
So, but there was a lot of lost potential had we invested in those areas, and we simply didn't. The same thing with my approach to Russia would be similar to my approach to places like Iran, if I had a chance, because Iranians don't want to be in some kind of weird-ass Cold War with the U.S.
No.
What they want is to steadily improve their own democracy and improve their own quality of life, and therefore trade and investment and further education and cooperation there is in everyone's actual benefit, except for the corporations who make tons of money on conflicts. So we have to maintain that because we need a handful of very useful enemies. Russia is very, very useful there because of the Cold War, so there's no interest in investing in the rest of the Russian economy. We're perfectly happy to see them sell a ton of natural gas to the Europeans and keep the lights on in Russia, so to speak. But if there was real investment in tons of other sectors in the Russian economy, if it was still diversified, I mean, it's an old heuristic that I've occasionally used in classes, but if you're familiar at all with Wallerstein's modern world system, for the change about 5 centuries ago between like the older, more self-contained imperial model to like the more flexible kind of trade-based, nation states and moving goods around, and we all specialize on different thing. So like basically the rise of global capitalism, as an interesting paradigm shift, right? One of the features that it has that I find still kind of useful is in helping to get people to drop really useless terms like first world and third world,
right,
which don't mean what people think they do. I mean, it's literally a Cold War relic. It hasn't been relevant in a decade.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as any of these. There's no first, second world anymore.
Right.
But a difference between core and periphery does exist. And the periphery are all the states that were incorporated on an economic periphery where they are exporting, commodities as opposed to manufacturers. Like here are our minerals, here's our timber, here's our oil, and then they import the manufactured goods from the core countries. There's a handful of places in the world that are semi-peripheral. They're partly developed, they have partly responsible institutions, an effective tax base, everything else. They're partly industrialized, because the core countries, they're fully industrialized. Even if they, like the US or the UK, focus more on services, we're able to build anything we want. If we want to build a bridge to nowhere in Alaska, we could do it. We don't need a loan from the country to do it.
Right.
But peripheral countries do. Russia is semi-peripheral. So despite all of the development in the Soviet period, and despite all of the natural resources that they inherit from that in the largest chunk of the former Soviet Union, they're at best a semi-peripheral economy and massively underdeveloped. So given that the single biggest complaint a lot of Russians have isn't the stuff that Putin has to run on, which is the whole like national pride, beating the drums and nationalism stuff, It's actually their declining living standards. The Russian population has been falling for 20 years, largely due to things like alcohol poisoning and suicide, as well as emigration. People are miserable,
Hmm.
and they're miserable because there's not a lot left that they can really look to. They don't have the ideological stuff. They don't have, we're all, in this together and we're going to get better and better and better, da da da. So you can like tolerate the crap because you've got an ideology at least. Take that away, and you leave people even poorer and without like that psychological relief valve.
Hmm.
So they're miserable. If we had invested in these areas, in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, building better businesses, closer cooperation there, that could have helped to reduce tensions overall. As long as a lot of places remain mired in deep poverty and with the declining living standards, and instead your politicians locally focus on nationalism as a way to maintain their corrupt power, because these are all still fairly authoritarian states, then there's no real horizon for that population.
Right.
And it's useful to the people in power there, and to some extent to their population, to continue to see us as the enemy, because we continue to stoke that. If instead we were the ones saying, hey, we totally want to build a microchip factory in Kiev, but y'all won't let us, I mean, there's, anyway, as much as I dislike a lot of like neoliberal globalization and all the corporate stuff there, it is actually a window to reducing tensions. As much as I dislike the economic model currently used in much of Western Europe, as far as corporate control of different sectors, the simple fact is France and Germany are married, and there's no possibility of war between them anymore. I mean, it's literally unthinkable.
Right. But that predicates other industries besides defense sector actually
Right, exactly.
exerting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gotcha.
Exactly. And right now, the defense sector is the only thing that really profits by our investment in Eastern Europe. We don't have a lot of direct investments there. And we've honestly been, our direct foreign investment in much of the world has been declining steadily for years.
Right.
Meanwhile, we complain about the Chinese and their growing clout in the world, but it's because they're the ones building seaports in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're not.
Yeah.
They're the ones willing to, I mean, they have crazy terms just like we used to, but they're doing it,
Yeah.
and we're not. If we really wanted to maintain, if a kind of sustainable hegemony was the real goal, then that'd be the approach. We should have used the wealth and technical resources and whatnot to invest in other parts of the world, to raising global living standards, and that would get people more like connecting the American brand with something positive, instead of connecting it with, the support for dictators and occupation, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, our brand has declined considerably.
Yes. Yes, it
over
has.
the years, and it's sad to see. It's hard to sit in. You've seen that meme like with the Nazi guy saying, "Are we the baddies?" Like, it's like, yeah, I'm always like, oh god, because it hurts. You don't want to think that your country is the one that's causing so many problems in the world, but there's a reason that if you poll populations across the developed world and you ask them which country is the greatest threat to world peace, they all say the US.
Yeah.
Every rich country says the US.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because just empirically, that's the case.
Right.
Because we're selling weapons to other people who want to kill each other, and we profit off of that warfare. But we didn't need to. We could be profiting on other areas, and that's the real tragedy, I guess. Both for any kind of values we might have, as well as like, real economic development anywhere. If instead of selling tons of guns overseas, we were like, I don't know, let's build like, wind turbines and sell them like the Germans are. We could have been making tons of money around the world doing that.
Or actually like set up a kind of, I like the idea of setting up a, not like cookie cutter because that makes it sound cheap, but like a rapid development of hospitals wherever we need to. Seems like that would be something you could have just a template for. This is what you need, and just let's go.
Yeah, and sadly, a lot of Western European countries that are far smaller and poorer than us spend a lot more money on exactly that kind of stuff. Instead of investing so much money in their defense sectors, they're able to deploy hospitals and facilities like that in different places and
Yeah.
actually provide genuine humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about, if you look at just the raw numbers in terms of like foreign aid, I mean, per capita, the US is one of the stingiest rich countries. You know, in absolute dollars, we're pretty high up there just because our economy is so big.
Right.
But what's often lost when people talk about those numbers is that most of US foreign aid is weapons.
Right. And it's a kind of aid, but it's not helping people.
Yeah, exactly. It helps somebody, but not the people living
Yeah.
there, really.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that if you really wanted to reduce tensions, if we really wanted to help things out, really that'd be the way to do it. And honestly, if Ukraine had developed better in its post-Soviet years, and not only in terms of its economy, but also more responsible, less corrupt governance and whatnot, then I don't think you would see the same kind of separatist conflict. It's
Right.
fueled in part by a nihilism born of, you know, just total hopelessness. You see no real horizon. So that attracts people to all these crazy white supremacist militias because they're offering them an easy answer
Yeah.
when they're faced with like misery and alcoholism. So why not sign up and go shoot some people? But if the whole country had been getting steadily richer, and they had, you know, passed laws to allow like people to use their own language, like Russian schools in the East, whatever, no big deal stuff, then it could have died down. Instead, though, there's been almost an incentive to, on our side, foster the opposite. And there's a lot of like less well reported examples of that you can point to. Estonia, I think, is a good one there, because Estonia has a small Russian minority. Because it was part of the Soviet Union for quite a few years. Some people moved across the border and live there now. And when it became independent, they passed a law saying Estonian is our national language. Fuck Russian, it's out. And that kind of like left a lot of people going, what the hell? And there's a portion there that kind of miss the old Soviet days and the connections there. But we sort of benefit from those nationalistic policies because that's how Estonia gets to be in NATO and comes closer to us and helps to continue that cycle of tension. So instead of helping the populations learn to live together and find some way to like survive in their neighborhood, we instead help them to maintain the tensions in the area. We benefit from those nationalistic tensions in the area. So a lot of the slow disintegration of Ukraine in the last 20 years here, with the fights between the West and the East of it, I mean, it's so predictable how we would have gotten involved in this, and what we'd benefit from. If we had, we did everything wrong in terms of helping to keep it stable and growing.
What's fascinating about that explanation is the maintaining of like ethnic tensions and regional tensions and the fanning of those nationalistic flames is interestingly what Russia is accused of doing here. And they learn it, parrot it back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's honestly kind of it's sad, but also a little bit amusing, the degree to which a lot of contemporary Russian politics have embraced neo-fascist models. I mean, Putin regularly quotes 1940s Russian fascist thinker Ivan Ilyin in his speeches, but then says his enemies are the real fascists. The Americans are the real fascists, because that's kind of how that always works. You always project outward, in any kind of like totalitarian politics. The old Soviet model kind of collapsed, but the fascists and Nazis always had certain elements of that, like they were always sort of centrist economically. So you could still, from the perspective of a Putin, pine for more of that state intervention in the economy, more of like the Soviet-style structure and the bureaucratization. But instead of dressing it up in international communism, dress it up in nationalism. And the U.S. has long benefited from spreading and fostering nationalist movements around the world too.
Yeah.
Because we benefit from a lot of the instability that causes in different places. And of course, it helps to fuel our defense spending and everything else. So the Russians do definitely play with nationalist politics in the area, but they learned that from us and the Western Europeans, and we've never stopped doing it.
Yeah. So two things. First of all, many who ask that question says they appreciate when Philly lefties understand history and spheres of influence. They think your answer was great. Also have another question of what is that behind you? I think they're referring to the kind of, there's like a shadow.
The darker thing here?
Yeah.
That is my grandfather's organ.
Okay.
It's a pump organ.
Oh, cool.
I don't know if you can see the keyboard here. You can still get a bit of a tone from it, but there's the bellow. At some point, I want to try and stitch the bag back together better so it works better.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it was they of the stuff that was in their house, it was one of the very few items that was specifically willed to an individual, because I was the only one that was ever able to play it.
Oh, very
so my
cool.
gramps wanted to make sure I got it. So it's sort of like blocking part of my
part of your bookshelf,
part of the bookcases, but whatever.
No, that's fine. That's cool. That's cool.
But this is the best room to put it in, I guess.
Yeah. I had another question on you to pick your brain about. This is where Cold War really enters the 21st century. Is there's two aspects technologically that I see Russia and US both posturing about publicly, which I find very interesting, because usually those, if it's intended to be a tactic that a power intends to use, usually they'll be quiet about it. If it's one that they just want to use as a threat or message, then they'll go public about it. And one of those is Russia, ahead of posturing at Ukraine, they issued their threat saying, we have these anti-satellite missiles and we can take out the global GPS network. And then the US recently has said, we can shut down Russia from accessing like 5G networks and cell networks. And obviously we've also seen a fair bit of cyber attack interplay stuff. And I'm kind of wondering how any of that will play out, because what's very interesting about cyber attacks is they can levy a lot of short-term, potentially long-term economic damage without provoking the visceral reaction from the population, because there's not bodies, left behind.
Right.
And I wonder if you think that there will be a fair bit of that jumping around in the years to come.
This is one of the years like before where we were talking about how we just don't pay attention to certain things. Mm-hmm. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviets were actually better at a lot of the infiltration and spycraft than we were.
Right. Yeah.
They were a lot more subtle. They were willing to plant people in for very long periods of time and climb up. I mean, hell, at one point, it actually toppled the German government of Willy Brandt, because they got like one of his senior advisors turned out to be a Soviet agent. Oops.
Wow.
They were quite good at that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they were also really good at the technological aspects of spying.
Yeah.
And none of that went away. The Soviets invested far more heavily in like the STEM disciplines, and cranked out tons and tons of really good engineers, scientists, computer programmers and whatnot. And that has stayed kind of a lifeblood of the post-Soviet world in places like Russia and Ukraine, because they didn't have a lot else to really play with. They had to put those people back to work in some way. Mm-hmm. And they knew that they couldn't continue the same kind of military posturing they did in the Soviet period, where the defense spending was so much higher, and you had the ideology to help people swallow that.
Right.
They had to find other ways to maintain their influence and to be able to score points. And we don't pay a whole lot of attention when, the Russian media starts bragging about some cool thing that they did with their hackers, because it doesn't really affect us in most cases. But they actually gain politically from doing things like this. And there's very few downsides to it, because there's not much anybody can do about it. And this again gets back to how interconnected the fossil fuel industry is in the world and how dependent East Asia and Western Europe are on importing fossil fuels. So you can't truly punish the Russians for, breaking in and stealing secrets or this or that, because, anything that would seriously bite would hurt us as well. So it's an area that they can easily get away with continuing to interfere, and I don't think that's stopping anytime soon.
Right.
This was sort of lost on a lot of people too, because there was, and some of it very justifiable, a lot of the whole like pushback against the whole Russia Gate, and the collusion narratives and all that, because there was a lot of truly partisan nonsense involved there, and both sides pushing a narrative that advantaged only their side and didn't pay just attention to what really happened.
Right.
But while they didn't actually turn an election or change a single vote or anything else, I'm sure they were actually actively trying to access, the voting machines in several states.
Yeah.
And successfully got into a number of them. We don't think they did anything other than download voter lists, but they got into a lot of election systems in the U.S. And it's hard for us to take seriously things like that because our media space is so heavily politicized and tribalistic. So if you point out, that they were getting into this stuff, it was like, well, you're into like Russiagate and conspiracies and blah blah blah, pro-democrat. Like, no, I don't give a shit about that at all. That has nothing to do with like pointing out that something happened.
Right.
It sort of insulates us from that reality. So I think that they have a tremendous amount of leverage to do that. They can continue to do it with impunity, and not just here. They do it far more effectively in other countries than they do too.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So they're going to continue to do that sort of thing because it is one of the few ways that the Russians can still flex some legitimate muscle and not just like, I don't know, the imaginary muscle of like flying, atomic bombers.
Yeah, and then there was like the oil pipeline that got hacked and stuff, and like one interesting thing about targets like that I thought is the target is profoundly unpopular here, so the population doesn't really give a shit. Like, fuck oil companies, right?
Exactly. I mean, if they broke in and wiped out a lot of banks' profits or something, or like wiped out our debts, do you think people would really care?
No.
I mean, and regardless, the partisanship is gonna overshadow literally anything that they do in the U.S.
Yeah.
And again, they know that.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things that you do have to give the Russians some credit for, is the degree to which they pay close attention to the psychology of their adversary.
Yeah.
And they've been watching us for a long, long time, and they know what they can get away with and what they can't.
Yeah.
And we don't do nearly as good a job, and never did. Everything from like, Kennan's ridiculous note, and to Truman, from that point on, really, we have consistently gotten stuff wrong about what the Russians actually want. And over and over again, we're proven that we see the documents, we see what they were actually aiming for, and we were totally wrong about it, and we still don't bother to change, because there are some people who benefit from us getting it wrong too, so it's fine.
Right.
But it affects our understanding of it, and it affects the way the media will portray things.
Okay. Very interesting.
I mean, any kind of actual conflict, any kind of actual war, the Russians stand no chance at all. I mean, I see people on left and right talk about, whoa, this president or that president's going to get us into World War III and we'll fight the Russians. There's no way in hell. Same with the Chinese, even as their economy is going to slip past ours soon, and keep growing, there's no chance of an actual conflict. I mean, we're too far away. It's way too expensive to do it. Everyone has way too much to lose, and the global economy is too interconnected.
Yeah, the expensive part is what gets me. Like, I don't think if we actually tried to open up shooting that necessarily China or Russia would commit to shooting back. I think they would pull into a defensive posture, ratchet up global support for them as the one being aggressed on. Meanwhile, both of them actually could put a lot of economic tension back on us. Not as much as we could put, but if they're able to maintain global support and we're seen as the aggressor, that it's China especially. If they decided, we're not going to ship you any microchips or anything, for the foreseeable future, our population would get really mad real fast.
Right, exactly. There's a tremendous amount of leverage there. I mean, it would
Yeah.
hurt them too, but all the
Yeah.
Russians have to really do is like close off the gas pipelines,
Yeah.
and
And
there
weather
would
the
be
storm for
such
a
a
while.
massive outcry as like, yeah, the costs shoot up for people all across Western Europe. People start literally freezing to death in Northern Europe because the heat's too expensive,
Yeah.
and yeah, they would win. So the interconnectedness in the economy does present serious challenges for any kind of larger conflict like this, but it also provides a break on that kind of brinksmanship.
Right.
And you mentioned a really an interesting scenario in which they could basically sit back, lose technically, and then claim victory. There's
Right.
a fun parallel they can make there to like to Nasser in the 56 Suez crisis in Egypt, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded, took control of the Sinai and the Suez Canal. And so Egypt got its ass thoroughly kicked very quickly. But Nasser won.
Mhm.
He came out of that looking like solid gold to people because he managed to get both the Soviets and the US to back his sovereignty, and Britain and France had to pull out.
Right.
So you can militarily lose. If you do it in such a way, though, you can still come out ahead. You can actually win a political victory. I think that if it came to actual combat, what we'd see is much smaller scale exchanges of fire,
Yeah.
more on the level of like skirmishes, kind of more akin to like the Sino-Soviet wars,
I
where it
imagine.
doesn't really get out of hand.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of it would also just be over proxy things.
Yeah, where we can. Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what's happening in Ukraine.
Right.
If we dump in tons and tons of weapons there, we get Ukrainians to fight against the separatists in the east. A lot of those separatists in the east, separatists at this point, some of them are just like Russians in Ukrainian uniforms or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, there's heavy Russian security cooperation already with those factions there in the east.
Yeah.
So it's been for many years an active, ongoing proxy war,
Mhm.
and we could easily continue something like that for the foreseeable future.
Mhm.
It's one of the consequences of beating the drum about this now, is that it maintains a low level support for continuing that kind of proxy conflict. As long as we can paint the Russians as the aggressor and they want to annex part of Ukraine and blah blah blah, and they took Crimea, and yes, they did take the Crimea, so you can legitimately say, hey, look, bad guy, victim, blah blah blah, then it justifies continuing to dump money into there. And who really suffers? Ukrainians. They're going to shoot each other. And as they continue to do that, again, their living standards keep falling, their government gets more and more corrupt, and nothing gets better for anybody.
Right.
So it serves the interests of a handful of powerful factions, but it hurts everybody in the long run. But a lot of that just comes from how interconnected we are economically, that we can't push things so far anymore. They want to keep them on like lower level. If we have conflict at all, it'd be more like in the skirmish level. And then you push a lot of that onto proxies and just keep selling the weapons.
Mhm.
But you can maintain those tensions, probably indefinitely. If we're still tolerating these kind of things now, decades after the Cold War ended, I see no realistic prospect that Americans are going to lose interest in it anytime soon.
Which does raise a question in my mind, which I don't expect you to have an answer for. How do we societally get into an off-ramp on supporting this kind of thing? Like, how do we move from where we are?
Yeah, no, you're right. There's no easy answer to that at all. There are plenty of possibilities and things that you can start, but it's such a complex phenomenon. We could spend years talking about it and not really get anywhere. But there's because you have it's some of the levels of control within the economic and political space are so deeply entrenched that it's really impossible to critique them.
Mm-hmm.
You're familiar with this, I know, because you've been talking a lot about criminal justice for a while. The fact that Americans can beat their chest and say, we're America #1, freest country in the world, at the same time that
Highest per
the
capita.
police shoot 1,000 people a year,
yes. That
and
we know of.
24% of the world's prison population. It's a
Yeah.
big deal that 5 people are shot by police in Germany every year, and they're like, oh, this is a scandal, this shouldn't happen. And we're like, yeah, 1,000 people, they deserved it, and we can turn a blind eye to it. the systems, the matrix of control that's gotten into our heads over the decades is so pervasive,
Yeah.
and the media concentration is so great that it's really hard to get out any kind of alternative to it. I mean, the fact that they'll point to people like Bernie Sanders and say he's literally Stalin shows you just how out of touch and dishonest people are going to be
Yeah.
about this, and they'll get away with it. I mean, that you can call Democrats like satanic pedophiles or something, and thousands of people line up to say, yes, that's definitely true. What? Like, but it works.
Right.
Because I think because of that, it's a little too deep to have any realistic solution anytime soon. There
Can
are things we can do,
Mhm.
and there are steps that on an individual level we can take that start pushing in the right direction. But we're talking about mass movements active for decades before
Yeah,
we'd have any real
generational
change.
change.
Yeah,
Can
it's multiple generations.
can education play a hand in that? Because obviously our current education system does an abysmal job of teaching politics and civics and anything like
Yeah.
this. Um, one
I
of
mean, quite a few states have actually removed civics from their education entirely,
Yeah.
which is just terrifying. I mean, literally terrifying.
Yeah, it is.
And I mean, the way that they've ratcheted up attacks on media too. I mean, without
Yeah.
the fourth estate, there's no realistic prospect of any democracy surviving.
Yeah.
But if we don't trust any of the things that we see, and again, there are legitimate reasons to distrust a lot of corporate media, but if we have no faith in media at all, then we don't have a democracy. It's
Yeah,
literally impossible.
it's the kind of thing where like I still consume a fair bit of mainstream media, but I also go through and try to verify primary sources where I can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's
Right.
there's a really interesting case in scene in Finland of they actually have in primary school a system where everyone that grows up there goes through learning how to critically consume information and analyze it against, who is this by? Do they have a vested interest in something? Can I analyze these statistics? Like, is there something off about, like they actually teach a fair number of things to look for to identify
Right.
propaganda and misinformation. And that came about because they are a Soviet, adjacent kind of, and have been living with a deluge of propaganda for decades. And that
Right.
seems to have a pretty good effect on how people there consume media. Uh,
Absolutely.
I don't know how we would get something like that here. We don't even have a national curriculum, but
Right. And no chance of getting one anytime soon.
right.
Yeah, the obstacles I think are it's I try to be an optimist
Mhm.
about human potential, about as much as I can be an optimist, but a lot of what I study is pretty darn depressing, and a lot of the conclusions it necessarily forces are pretty depressing. I don't see any realistic prospect of major change there without multiple generations consciously building alternative institutions that can become significant enough that they can take the place of those other ones. It's a hell of a fight. As
Mhm.
far as education, yeah, education could play a massive role in improving that if it actually taught critical reason, but it doesn't. And American education never did because it wasn't designed to. I'll try to. I got to be careful here because the potential of wandering off into something big is there. But okay, so short in terms of like when we started creating school systems,
I might pull
when they
you in
started
for
rolling out.
another talk on this, but go ahead.
Well, anytime. Yeah. But uh, yeah, my evenings are usually fun times to chat because by this point of the day, I usually writing or reading. Uh, but the school systems were created initially as means of spreading conscious nationalistic ideologies of bringing people together.
Okay.
When they started rolling these things out, you were dealing with a lot of states that needed to create a kind of homogeneity in the population. They needed to create a sense of uniformity. A lot of places that we, as Americans, again, connected from the world, think of as homogenous aren't. I mean, France had dozens of languages. Germany had a dozen languages. Italy had a dozen languages. They were when these states were put together. I mean, Sicilian and Venetian are not mutually intelligible. Italian, like you'd study in school, is an invented modern language based on the Tuscan language.
Hmm.
And most Italians have to learn it in school because they'll speak Venetian at home and they'll speak Italian in the streets. And that's still the case after almost 2 centuries since rolling out public school systems across the first half of the 19th century, when these started to become much more common. So they were consciously created to cultivate a sense of like ethno-nationalism, to create like a sense of like unity there. The American education system always maintained that. And we've never really lost it. We still have like very, very small children giving a literal loyalty oath, like just straight up North Korea shit with the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, I don't want to, 6-year-olds saying I want to die for my country, but that's what we ask them to do. I mean, the point of early education always has been to indoctrinate you into the useful myths for a given society. That's literally how it was designed in the first place. It doesn't mean it has to be that way. What happens in the US and still in a lot of other developed countries is that the people who go off to college, one of the things that we have to do in my profession is break that indoctrination and teach people to.
Hold on. We might have lost him. Just a moment. Just a second.
Don't be afraid to borrow. Chord progressions, sounds.
Let me try. I'm back.
Just snatch them all up.
Oh no, the government shut down Liam. The Illuminati got him. Okay. Okay. Or
borrowing something that I heard.
I think, yeah. I think we may have to end it there. Oh, wait. No. Hello?
I thought it was not original enough.
Hey.
But I quickly found out that I'm not.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's still starting to reload this thing. Discord just crashed on me.
Okay. we were speculating about whether the government, Illuminati, or Russian hackers got you.
Oh yeah, definitely the Bavarian Illuminati.
Bavarian Illuminati. There you go.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, we got him back.
No, gosh, I don't know where it. I don't know where it dropped though. What was the last thing I said?
That you were saying that the education system was formed for that, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so just short on this is that.
And the specific point you paused at was in college you have to break people's programming.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So, yeah, it forces us to kind of like undo some of that, because primary and secondary education in the Western world was never designed to teach critical reasoning skills.
Mm-hmm.
It was designed to create useful subjects. And I don't mean this in a weird, like, kind of conspiratorial sense, like, ooh, they're pulling our strings. It's a much more organic process than that. But as states became more and more centralized, they needed to create a homogenous population that would work together, right? Because you're replacing, older ideologies like religious sects or this or that, and creating like a kind of a common national identity and state loyalties and this and that. So they were created for a very specific purpose in the 19th century. And some places, I like that you mentioned the Finns, have started to move away from that and realize, you know what? We could do more things with education. We could do better by people. And there's no real taste for that here. Instead, we've been heading in the opposite direction for a long time, with more and more skepticism about public schooling. as well as a lot of policies that consciously undermined it, like teaching to standardized tests, which just continues to show Americans doing terribly by international standards in literacy. I mean, hell, the Finns have such a weirdly complicated language that they don't even have like a true sense of like, past or future. Like it's a difficult language to get right, and yet they achieve literacy faster than we do. The Japanese have to learn 4 different writing systems to become literate, and they still achieve higher literacy rates than we do, because we just don't put a lot of effort into this stuff anymore. We could, and it would do a lot, but instead, because it's so decentralized in the US to different states, and there's been such a conscious propaganda campaign to make people distrust any kind of education. And it's funny that the right is talking about schools as indoctrination centers when that's literally why they created them in the first place, and it was a conscious right-wing policy in the first place to do it that way.
Yeah.
It was how we got it across. Like you had like all your progressive, liberally type, people, saying, yeah, education systems seem like a good thing, and they're like, well, I'm skeptical, but I'll be okay with education systems as long as we have this, that, and the other thing
So,
as part of it.
so they're right about it being an indoctrination center, just wrong about what it's indoctrinating.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that it honestly
Yeah.
benefits them to
Yeah.
a large degree and helps to make possible a lot of the crazy propaganda they get away with. I mean, the fact that it fails so spectacularly to teach a lot of critical reasoning skills is why people can believe that there are like, satanic Nazi Marxists that are running the United States secretly, and like, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we just like look at like Lauren Boebert's Twitter feed.
God.
It's just like,
No.
holy shit. And then just you see tens of thousands of likes on these things. It's just like, it's heartbreaking, but it's also entirely predictable.
Yeah.
Because Reagan got away with mainstreaming, John Birch Society bullshit,
Yeah.
between the 60s and the 80s, and it worked. I mean, they were so batshit crazy that no mainstream politician wanted to touch that stuff in the 60s. And now it's extremely tame
Yeah.
by comparison. So we've been primed for literally the opposite of what you're pointing to in terms of like what role could education play. Sadly, it's playing exactly the wrong role. It's making things steadily worse, and there's no realistic prospect of making it better because we can't do things like national curricula.
Is it
You
something
would be
that
seen as a conspiracy anyway.
is it something that if enough, I mean, I know it wouldn't be nationwide, but could communities, people who were invested in this, who understood it, get, work school boards and actually shift things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where, okay, so just to get like a hopeful point in here, because you're asking what can we do about this?
Yes.
And a lot of stuff I talk about, again, is pretty depressing shit, so I get that.
I always
But
try to find something
there's-
that people can put their
Yeah.
hands towards.
Exactly, yeah, and I have to do that in a lot of my classes too, because I'm talking about all this depressing stuff like genocide. How do you make genocide? Like, where's the hopeful side there? Like, okay, well, here's how we can learn how to prevent these things, and that's you got to like find those places. One of the things that the right has been brilliant at, especially since the 1970s, that set the stage for the Reagan Revolution and the Gingrich Revolution in '94. That this just completely changed American politics. They're playing the long game. They started capturing school boards, and then county boards of supervisors, and then state assemblies, and then moved up from there. And you still don't see good people running. There's tons and tons of nonpartisan races in this country for county seats and school board seats and whatnot, and there is a tremendous amount of influence you can have there. The problem is, you have a lot of wealthy benefactors putting up far-right loons for school board, and no one wants to put the trouble into trying to raise funds to try and run a decent candidate to do that. If we got involved and took over the school boards, yes, we could write good curricula on a local level. Because ultimately, the individual districts have a tremendous amount of control in terms of what gets presented. And if you get more and more control of them and they're out of step with the state's education directives, then that provides a rationale for running assembly candidates then and taking and getting more involved at the state level. So working your way up that way gives you the ability to start shaping the narrative there. local politicians have a tremendous amount of power over our lives, and most people, on the left and liberal sides, are completely oblivious to it, and they concede tons of those seats to batshit right wingers.
Hmm. Okay. Well, that provides some sort of blueprint, and it sounds like actually studying the way the right did it previously over the last several decades is a decent map
It
to
is.
to analyze.
Strategically, there's some brilliant moves there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's some crazy, it's some Machiavellian shit,
Right.
but you know, especially in terms of the arguments for the media
Mhm.
aspects of it, the messaging, the kinds of things they wanted to push, but
Right.
the strategy was quite effective.
Mhm.
I mean, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives for almost 40 years straight. I mean, the New Deal consensus was like lock solid, and through multiple presidencies. And never mind, like FDR was elected 4 times, but then you got Truman, in there, for one on his own, but also finishing off most of Roosevelt's fourth term. Eisenhower didn't touch it at all. So Eisenhower ran for 2 terms as essentially a New Deal Republican.
Mhm.
And then you get into Kennedy and Johnson, and there's that same consensus behind those policies. It doesn't start to break down until Nixon's second term. That New Deal consensus was solid, and people forget today, and then this is a good one, I think, to give a sense of hope to a lot of like the depressed leftists in the country. Literal Marxists used to take 20% of the vote in Oklahoma. Literal socialists used to run large parts of like Wisconsin or Minnesota.
Mm.
Like people would move in and you could control local municipalities. I mean, Milwaukee was run by socialists. I mean, and not like the modern kind of like AOC, Bernie Sanders socialists, which are just basically like centrist social democrats. But I mean like literal
Right.
socialists.
Right.
Because when we were willing to talk to farmers and workers and ordinary people and actually engage and work and do local politics, it worked.
Mhm.
But it's all sort of like collapsed, and it's become very, very kind of like insular. There's just complaining about it. There's no real engagement. It's easy to say, well, corporate media, blah blah blah, duopoly, blah blah blah, we can't get involved. That's ultimately not true. People can get involved and you can participate, and doing so, we know, has benefits because the right did it.
Mhm.
I mean, they managed to completely destroy the New Deal consensus because of moves they started taking in the 1960s. And it, by the time you get into Nixon in his first term was still talking about universal health care on the British model and a basic income. I mean, like, and he created the EPA, for crying out loud. I mean, like, things today that no Democrat could get away with, much less a Republican.
Right.
And yet in his second term embraced the Chicago school, started turning hard right on tons of social issues, largely because of the challenge from people like Reagan in the 60s from California, and the mainstreaming of that kind of like batshit Bircher stuff.
Right.
The more that they pushed that at the local level and at the state level, the more it took control over national politics. So if you want to tip the direction back toward the left, you have to start at the city and county levels. You have to start at your school boards and work your way up into the different states. The more we can capture attention in different states, then you can shift the national narrative back in a better direction.
That makes sense. I mean, also in local politics, you do have a platform. Even just like a city council member or a school board member does have a
Mm-hmm.
platform, can move the language that people are comfortable with in your community,
Absolutely.
and introduce ideas. So I like that.
Yeah, and the more you build that up at the local level, and the more you build it up in like the city and county level,
Hmm.
the more it becomes possible to run those kind of candidates then at the state level,
Yeah.
because you're building a constituency in a particular area. If you can get in and actually accomplish something, I mean, look, I mean, realistically, Vermont is a rural state,
Hmm.
right? It's a rural state, and socially, it had been pretty conservative outside of places like Burlington, and Sanders had been untouchable there
Yeah.
because he actually delivers for people. That authenticity and actually engaging with people, talking about them, and bringing things really to them.
Hmm.
It can work, and it's essentially a model for what we could have been doing for the last several decades, instead of like following the DLC Clinton sort of line and getting more and more corporate, was to adopt the same kind of technique, because all Sanders was doing in Vermont was what the right was doing elsewhere, getting involved directly in local politics,
Hmm.
networking with ordinary people, and then showing them a path to a better life for them and their kids.
Hmm.
And if you can, it doesn't matter how conservative somebody is in a particular area, if you can show them, I can make life better for your kids, and then you get in and you do that, it gives you a foundation to spring forward and take more of those positions climbing up the ladder into the state politics.
Yeah.
And if you can start pushing a number of states in a better direction, I love that the right is always talking about, I live in California, I guess we're opposite sides of the country here. But
Yep.
California is as capitalist as it gets.
Yes.
I mean, this is a massively neoliberal state, and leftist politicians do not do well at the state level at all. Like, they get crushed all the time. But you wouldn't know that if you pay attention to the mainstream media. Everyone's always thinking like California's as left as it gets and super progressive, and no, it's not. I mean, we are massively in bed with major corporations here.
Yeah.
But you could change that by running actually better candidates, whether Democrats or independents at local levels, and start having an impact on state politics. And actually, because the population as a whole is pretty tolerant.
Yeah.
And there's a foundation for pushing in a better direction. But our politicians are way out of step, just like they are at the national level. I mean, at the national level, all of our major politicians are authoritarian right-wingers.
Yes.
There's no actual left. But we could build one at a local level, take that up to a state level, and then eventually, take over. And that's the Republican approach, and it's worked. From the 60s to now, it took a while. But at this point, the fact that no one bats an eye when you can say the most insane things on the right tells you how effective it was at capturing and building a very loyal base.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that anyone will hand Marjorie Green a microphone is, yeah.
Yeah, it's frankly terrifying.
Yeah.
And people, in the mainstream especially, you see that there's a lot of reticence in the media to note the sort of parallels, and a lot of caution even among a lot of academics who study this, because it's sort of a scary thing for a lot of people. But the American right, in its basic character, is more fascist than conservative.
Oh yeah, no, they're
and has been for a long time. There's
very
a
much
nationalistic
proto-fascist
trend that's been there for a long, long time. And when you see with a lot of these people, like like people like Boebert are attacking corporations now. The anti-vax thing has got more of them doing it. Tucker Carlson's been doing it for years, attacking major corporations. What they're laying the foundations for is a kind of third way right populist politics, which is literally Mussolini and Hitler's line.
Yes.
So it's drifted pretty far from the older consensuses, but it's working, and it took a while to get there. So I see absolutely no reason why if you're willing to do the work on the ground, if you're willing to actually get out there and knock doors and talk to people, and if we can raise money, in order to support local candidates, there's no reason the same thing couldn't happen.
Yep.
So I'm always been very optimistic about that possibility. The problem is getting people to be willing to do the work,
right,
instead of just complaining,
and to actually run for local office, like all our offices.
Yeah.
Everyone gets obsessed
Right, exactly.
about the presidency, but
right,
yeah,
but most of the power over our lives is actually local still.
Right.
We completely discount those things, and we've ceded so much power. I mean,
it's also
Democrats
true.
used to control we had Democrats had 3/4 of state houses.
Yeah, it's
and
also
today they have 1/3.
Yeah, it's also true if what you're describing sounds like national politics are, and this intuitively makes sense, that national politics end up being a reflection of your local politics. So
Right. Yep. Change people's attitudes on the local level. I mean, it's a matter of like getting into people's heads. If we're willing to do that work, and we're actually willing to engage in that struggle of ideas at the local level, don't just preach at people through the media or whatever, and you silly rednecks or something, which a lot of people do. Actually engage and talk to people and show them, what you can do, and then by getting involved in local offices, prove that you can do it. I mean, that's ultimately what helped, Bernie take control of Vermont as a whole, was that he actually did a bang-up job for 10 years as mayor, and actually improved the lives of ordinary people, and they could see that. You know, it doesn't matter if you disagree on this or that social issue. If you can see this is definitely going to improve the lives of my kids, you start bringing people more and more on board.
Yeah.
But you have to be willing to play the long game to do things like that.
Right. Well, I have pulled your ear for 2 hours here.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, I know.
Oh, jeez. That happens.
I figure it's a good time to let you go. I appreciate you taking the time. This has been very illuminating. In the next month or two, I might want to actually have you on to talk about education a bit more, because I think you've got some more thoughts there that I'd like to drill into. But yeah, always a pleasure to talk to you, Liam.
Yeah, thanks much. I appreciate it, and likewise, I always enjoy the questions, and I enjoy the things that will come out of the chats from people and whatnot.
Yeah.
And yeah, education is fun too. I mean, I'm stuck in tertiary education. I'm teaching college levels, but
Right.
I intentionally I'm teaching at two different universities, and they're very, very different. One of them is in a wealthy area with mostly people that come in and they're all like a bunch of trust fund kids driving around BMWs, and the other one is literally a working class neighborhood where I don't know if you know like the whole Compton or Watts or whatever, like the southern LA, like historically very, very poor area,
Yeah.
not very good high schools, and that's the other university I'm teaching is in that area, right? And I enjoy the contrast there and dealing with the kinds of things people get, like the foundation they get, how well prepared are they for college, because it's still very classist in this country, the basic
Yes.
structure for it. And I think we could do so much better to make this work for people and give them a real education, and we're just not at all. So yeah, I'd be happy to rant about that for a little while sometime.
Absolutely. All right. So I will catch you later. I'll be cutting this to YouTube, and I'll send that link over to you as well.
Sure, yeah,
But
I'll
yeah.
be happy to share it.
Everyone in chat really appreciated the your insights. Found it thought-provoking. Yep.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. Have a great night.
You too.